All right, everybody, welcome back to episode 14 of the Actionable Alignment podcast. I am here with someone whose passion is in health, strength, and body composition. They are puzzles that can be solved, and this man's passion is educating people around him on how to solve them. Jake is a holistic coach and educator who primarily works with three groups of people. One, those wanting to reach the ceiling of their own potential in the gym. Two, those wanting to optimize their health and regain quality of life by healing from chronic ill health. And three, practitioners wanting to go deeper than what their respective fields conventionally offer and teach. Like I just said before we hit record, am a huge fan and so grateful and happy to have you here on the pod. Jake, how are you doing?
I'm doing amazingly, Zoe. Thank you for having me. You said my name perfectly. Everyone always mucks it up, so kudos to you. Yeah. So thank you for the amazing intro. I appreciate it.
Totally fine. Let's get down to business. Now, I would love to know, in terms of, again, the training, the gut health, blood work, all that sort of a thing, I would love to know your origin story. So what makes you so passionate about all of this? Where did you start and how did you get to where you are today with being able to share the knowledge that you have acquired?
So for me, I guess it went back to probably similar for a lot of coaches in the space, just really enjoying the component of being in the gym, enjoying like competition, whether that is sports or whatever. And I was lucky enough that I never really had any health issues myself. And I've been reflecting on this a little bit with clients lately where it's really easy to be, I guess, oblivious to some of the downsides of the medical system or the healthcare system if you've never experienced it yourself. Mm-hmm. And that was my journey. So my mum is she was a nurse, so she was in conventional medicine. I'd never questioned conventional medicine. And so I was working in a gym, just working with coaching clients. And my partner at the time, she was doing everything perfectly. Like she was working with an amazing coach. She was doing logging every single thing she ate. She was training super hard, doing everything as well as anyone else. I could see she was being meticulous, but she was not getting any results. And I remember thinking this doesn't add up. Like everyone else I'm working with, they're getting results. I can see how hard you're working. You're not getting anything. And it drove me to learn more about blood work and stool testing. I started mentoring with one of my colleagues, Dave O'Brien. Mm-hmm. And in that process, we found out she had parasites, she had all these other issues going on, and we were able to, start to actually make headway when we dealt with her gut health and sort of other health issues. But it became this sort of pattern that I started seeing with clients I was working with as well. And I started getting a lot of, especially female clients they were doing everything perfectly. They were eating what they were meant to be eating. They were working hard in the gym. They were doing what they were told to do, usually by, male coaches who hadn't really experienced that themselves, and they just weren't getting results. And it got to a point where I realized if we actually want to get good results with more than 60 to 70% of people, we actually need to be learning about this stuff as coaches. So at that point, I had no intention of going down the functional health space. And I kind of fell into blood work out of a necessity to help the clients I was working with. And then I found out, well, this is a huge gap. No one is actually not many people are doing this stuff well. And then this is similar times to when the pandemic happened and people weren't really in the gym anyway. And so I kind of got to a point where people were coming to me now because they had chronic health conditions, and it was separate from the gym. They were I don't even care about getting in the gym. My doctor hasn't helped me. I've seen 10 different specialists. I spent a decade doing this. I spent a small fortune trying to get better, and that started to become my clientele. And I was kind of scratching my head, being hang on, I'm a PT. Why are you coming to me? And that ended up being my sort of, coaching business for the next few years. I was still working with people on the side in the gym. But largely it's just people with health conditions. And then it kind of swung again the other way over the last couple of years where, especially strength coaches and PTs and practitioners who want to further develop, they've sort of seen, this, there's been this pendulum swing, in the fitness industry where bro science used to kind of be the thing and no one really cared about research and studies. And then it sort of swung to this point where people are so limited that if it's not in a study, they don't believe it and they won't do it. And I think there's a lot of people in the middle who are I just kind of want to know what works. I want to know what makes sense scientifically, but I also don't want to be contained and confined by, if it's not in the research outcome, I can't do it. And so I guess over the last couple of years, I've had a lot of people who are kind of pushing into that space, being like, hey, I want to learn more about hypertrophy and training. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess my coaching journey's evolved a little bit over the last decade or so. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like respectively, like respectfully, it should evolve. I feel like when we get stuck in that one, like you see PTs who are still PTing the same stuff that they learned 20, 30 years ago.
Totally.
And usually it is now those overloading methods that are just gassing people and causing excess inflammation. And again, like the people come in and train because their coach pushes them. And it's like, but what progress are you actually making there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that's made you stand out in the industry, to myself, to my clients and colleagues as well, is breaking that apart of like, what are you doing that's actually productive? What are you doing that's actually useful versus just what like might be a little ego stroke or feeling good, that sort of a thing. Yeah. So very cool. And then the gym that you worked at for quite a while, they also have quite a few courses online as well for coaches. Clean Health, I've done quite a few of those. And I do feel like they do a lot of in-house education as well, don't they?
They do, yeah, absolutely. So my journey to Clean Health was a funny one. So I was working in a small gym in Victoria, just like an Anytime Fitness. And I got to a point where I was just kind of going through the motions, and I was like, hey, if this is something I want to do, I really want to be good at it. And so I kind of looked around and I thought, what are the best places I know of that do this? Like, who are the leaders in this space? And there was a couple of gyms I identified, Clean Health being one of them. And they were probably on the top of my list. I had an affiliation with a lot of big coaches at that time, people like Charles Poliquin. And so I was like, hey, I'm just going to do this, right? I don't even live in the state, but I'll give it a go. Long story short, the head of Clean Health called me up and he's like, okay, if you want the job, it was like Friday afternoon. He goes, if you want the job, be here at 8 a.m. Monday morning and you've got it. I was working 2 different jobs. Like I had a place I was living in Victoria. I was like, holy crap. So literally packed up my bags, left the following morning, like gave notice of work that day and was there by 8 a.m. But yeah, like that's the reason I did that is because they did have a big focus on education. And, you know, a lot of coaches, and I'm sure it's the same with any industry, but a lot of people kind of get into different industries and they're like, well, I want to be the best now. And it's like, well, it's all well and good kind of wanting that and wanting to, you know, charge out at a certain amount of money or fill your books or whatever. But, you know, ultimately, I guess it's the experience. It's you know, your potential to learn from people who have experience beyond kind of what you're capable of having that's going to lead to that point. So, you know, I look at like my time at Clean Health, like initially I was basically like an intern, you know, like we started there, we were being paid just like a flat fee. Like we were there, I don't know, like 12-hour days. I was doing like 60 sessions a week. Like it was like, for all intents and purposes, it was basically slave labor initially, but the experience that you're getting, like that's the valuable part. So yeah, you know, we got to a point where we were doing a lot of in-house education stuff around nutrition, training, and you know, I was lucky enough that I was able to present a lot of those courses, which is a really good way to learn as well. Like if you're teaching other people, like you really need to know what you're talking about. So throughout my whole coaching journey, I've always really valued education. That's something I've enjoyed doing, but I found that it's been a blessing in the sense that it's forced me to learn more as well and forced me to keep pushing ahead so I you know, can feel confident in what I'm educating on. So definitely I think, you know, education is obviously one of the keys or one of the most important part for a coach who wants to not just be successful like business wise, but actually be good at getting results and being able to work with clients.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's very easy to, in an industry that's so easy to get into, like you can do a 6-week, 12-week course, to stand out over the years, that takes knowing a degree of what you're talking about. And that's something that for a lot of people wanting to build their business in the fitness industry, it is so beneficial to seek out those places that it might seem like slave labor. Can't speak properly. I remember my first gym that I worked at was Fitness Playground, and very similar in terms of being paid a little bit of a lower wage, but then we had lots of in-house education. They let you fail forward, and then they taught you how to brainstorm, fix things, and we had so many different sort of specialists come in and niche sort of workshops. And it helped then when I moved back to a commercial gym where I was paying my own gym rent then. I was like, I know exactly what I'm talking about in order to build my business
Yeah.
from the ground here again,
Yeah.
and really succeed and look after people, not just show up,
Yeah.
give them a booty workout, hope they stay for 6 weeks, long enough until I can
Exactly.
get the next client that signs up on board.
Exactly. Before I moved to Clean Health, my manager at the old gym I was at, his, I think, only piece of advice he ever gave me was when you get a new client in the door, make sure that they're sore the next day. Like, he's like, he literally was like, make sure they can't get up off the toilet. Yeah, that's how you know they've had a good workout. They'll be so sore, they'll realize they need you in their life.
Yeah.
And like, that's the level of knowledge, obviously, that, you know, most PTs and most PT managers are sharing. So I think sometimes it's worth taking that potential, you know, pay cut initially, like you said, to be exposed to information and content and people that are actually going to develop you.
Exactly. And it's you, like, you can choose as a new coach when you're desperate to earn the big bucks, when you choose to see it instead of being something like, oh, I'm not getting paid as much as I want to. It's like I'm investing into this education now from a time perspective. Like, if I'm not getting clients, I'm not having to pay rent for the clients that aren't there. That's huge.
Yeah.
And that's, a lot of people I
Yeah.
feel try and jump straight into battling it out in the commercial gyms
100%.
where you do pay rent, like Fitness First, that sort of a thing,
Yeah.
without having sort of those feathers in their cap. But yeah, so love that. Bit of a throwback for both of us.
Totally.
Now, in terms of training and talking about building muscle, so this is something you recently, over the last few months, you started your training account on Instagram.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, you've been posting so much valuable content on there, as well as in the weekly education group as well, which is on WhatsApp. Everyone listening, go sign up on Jake's little link on his Instagram. In terms of building muscle, let's debunk some myths. It's time. Okay.
Yeah.
How much of a surplus do you really need with calories to build a decent amount of muscle as a natural athlete? And for what sort of duration would you usually do that for with a client?
Yeah. So it's funny, like, such a simple question actually has a few moving parts to it. And people, I don't know what comes to mind when people even hear you ask that question, but a lot of the time we've got these preconceived ideas. And one of those preconceived ideas is that you need to be at a certain body fat percentage to build muscle. And, you know, people always sort of share this idea you need to be below. For guys, they'll talk about 14% or 16%, and there's all these markers or, you know, numbers being thrown out there. And if you're above that percentage and if any surplus you're in is just going to go to body fat and all this kind of stuff. So there's like that bit we need to debunk. And then there's, well, how much energy do we actually need? And you specified for a natural athlete. And that's an important specification or clarification, because I imagine a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to differ a little bit if someone's enhanced or someone's natural. And unfortunately, a lot of the information out there is usually coming from people who are enhanced. And, you know, that's all well and good, and I don't have anything against that, but it's not always applicable then to the natural athlete. So to answer your question, to actually get to it. So firstly, in terms of the fat percentage bit I touched on first, there's not really any good evidence to suggest that that's actually the case. So I don't think someone needs to be looking at it and being like, well, I probably shouldn't go into that surplus unless I'm at 14% body fat or whatever. What I'd say is, are you comfortable with your body fat percentages? And is your level of body fat percentage, is that affecting you metabolically? And if you've got poor metabolic function, you've got poor blood sugar regulation, you've got insulin resistance, whatever, okay, that's probably negatively impacting you to the point that it might actually impact your performance in the gym, your just sort of health in day-to-day life. Okay, maybe for you, it's not the time to actually enter into a hypertrophy phase or a bulking phase. Assuming that's not the case, then we need to look at the main two ways I'd answer this is, are you a total beginner or are you a little bit more experienced? Because beginners, like we all know, newbie gains, like beginners can build a whole stack of muscle really quickly. So the fact that they're simply building more muscle quicker, they can actually get away with a larger surplus, which is often the opposite of what people assume. People think, well, the more advanced I am, I'm going to need a bigger surplus, I need to eat more. I think that misconception probably comes from looking at enhanced bodybuilders, right? Like you look at Olympia competitors and you know, big enhanced bodybuilders, and they're eating 5,000-6,000 calories. And so people assume, well, if you're advanced, that's what you need to do. But in ultimate reality, the amount of muscle a natural athlete is building when they're an advanced athlete, it's really minute. Like we're talking very small amounts of actual tissue. So someone who's a beginner, if you just said, hey, I want to eat tell me to eat whatever to eat, and I'm like to put on as much muscle as possible, you could get away with like a good 20, maybe 25% surplus. Like that, sure, you'll gain a bit of body fat, but if you're just wanting to maximize stuff, you can push it up pretty high. For someone who's more advanced, honestly, like 10 to 15% is plenty. Like in reality, that 5 to 10% is probably going to be enough of a surplus for most people. But if you just said, I don't want to leave anything unturned, like I want to get everything out of it I can, I'd say, sure, let's push you up to that 15% and cover kind of all bases, and you will gain some body fat doing that. But in all reality, most people, that 5 to 10% is usually going to be okay for most advanced athletes.
Cool. I love that. And then in terms of pairing that nutrition protocol with training, how many days a week, if we're only having between, say, 5 to 15% of a surplus on top of our daily caloric needs, how many days a week should we be training for optimal muscle growth versus rest days?
So that's a big...
we're opening
a complex question.
Cans of worms.
We are. And it's, again, it sounds so simple. It's like, just give us a number.
Yeah.
But it kind of depends on how you want to be splitting that, on how well you recover. I would say to an extent, it depends a little bit on your baseline health as well. So if you're someone who has, like, I guess some inflammatory conditions, you've got an autoimmune condition, you've got some significant gut health issues, like in all reality, someone like that is going to take longer to recover between sessions, immune function's compromised. So that person's probably going to do better actually having like a day off between each session and like spreading out their volume like that. Where someone who's in a really like healthy state, someone who's maybe younger, they might be able to get away with a little bit more. So it depends a little bit on someone's individual state. But to sort of centralize ourselves on a bit of a number, what I'd say is we probably do want to look at weekly volume if we're just looking at like muscle growth. And if we just throw some numbers out there, I would say the majority of people, if we're talking good training, okay, so I'm talking like you're not going in there and doing a million repetitions with like 20 seconds between sets, like really low quality work. If we're talking good high quality work where you're taking a set close to failure, you're waiting enough between sets and stuff like that, well then most people are going to get best results. Usually like within a session, they're going to get best results up to that sort of 6 or 7 sets per muscle, sets per muscle. And then over the course of a week, we could probably push it up to 10 to 12 sets per muscle. So then the question is, how do we want to split that? Okay, if we're saying up to, and I'm not saying everyone needs to do 12 sets, I'm saying it's unlikely many people are going to get extra hypertrophy doing more than 12 sets per muscle, right, per week. So if we've got that 12 sets or less per week, how do we want to split that? Do we want to split it twice a week? Do we want to split it over 3 sessions? Honestly, I actually think 3 sessions per week per muscle makes most sense. And so the way we'll do that would be full body sessions. So to give you like a bit of an answer, I'd say like alternate days makes a lot of sense. So full body day off, full body day off. If we look at the way that natural athletes, like almost every single natural bodybuilder trained before drugs, before steroids, they almost all did that. They either did day on, day off, or they did 3 days a week. It'd be like a Monday, Wednesday, like Saturday morning often, or Friday. That was just what everyone did. They knew that worked best. So I think we can use some different splits and we can get away with maybe doing 4 days a week if we want. But we could safely say a large amount of people are going to get best results doing alternate day.
Yeah, cool. And so that would be 3 full body days would be sort of maximizing muscle growth with enough recovery in between.
Yeah.
What would you say? So that's for someone who's pushing their working sets within sort of 0 to 1 rep to failure. Would that be correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what would you say, because there are, and I definitely speak with a lot of women who are scared of pushing to failure on their own. So something more realistic for them is an RPE 7 to 8. So 2 to 3 repetitions in reserve. Does this change training volume required to stimulate muscle growth? Are the sets done that are sort of at 7 and below, are they rendered sort of worthless once you are, what would you call it, an intermediate athlete, once you've been training for sort of 2 years already?
So the way I would answer that is if we try to look at all the literature we have on hypertrophy and physiologically how we understand hypertrophy occurs, I think there's only one model we know of that actually seems to explain it. And that model is called the stimulating reps model, or maximally stimulating reps model. And there's, anytime we come up with a model, what we're doing is trying to look at, can this predict what we're going to see? Can it predict the outcomes we would expect? And there's always going to be some individual variation there. We're always using kind of like, broad numbers, and obviously there's going to be a little bit that'll change. But I think that model is the best way we can answer that question. So this model was devised by someone named Chris Beardsley, if people are interested. And essentially what it states is, in the literature, we see that sets taken, so like lower repetition sets, higher repetition sets, they seem to produce the same amount of hypertrophy. In terms of like reps in reserve, what you're talking about, we also get hypertrophy from reps in reserve, also from sets taken to failure. Depending on how far it is away from failure will depend on how much hypertrophy, whether we need to increase sets to match it. And so what this model predicts is that in each set taken basically to failure, there's going to be somewhere in the realms of about 5 repetitions that are going to maximally stimulate hypertrophy. The reason for that number, it's going to change a little bit, but how we get to 5 is what's called the force velocity relationship. So what we want, what basically is causing that hypertrophy is when there's an involuntary slowing down of contraction speed. Okay, so when you're towards the end of a set and you're trying to move the bar fast, but it's simply not moving fast, at that point there's a high amount of effort. You're using all the muscle fibers you can to actually move that weight, and because it's actually moving slow, there's actually a really long time to create mechanical tension. So there's like a lot of cross bridging that's occurring. That's what's causing the hypertrophy essentially. So based on that model, what we can say is if each set has somewhere in the realms of 5, maybe 4 to 6 maximally stimulating repetitions, if it's taken a failure, if someone's taking a set 2 to 3 repetitions in reserve, well, they're getting maybe half of what they would get if they took that set to failure. So I used that example a moment ago where I said some in the realms of 6 sets per muscle per session is probably where we see a plateau, and above that we don't get much additional hypertrophy. Bearing in mind, that doesn't mean we need to do 6. Like some people, 2 or 3 sets will be fine. But say, let's just work off 4 sets. Say we said, okay, 4 sets is a good number for most people to aim for. If you're doing sets like that, where you're taking them, a couple of repetitions in reserve, well, that 4 sets for you may now be maybe 6 to 8 sets, right? So we do just kind of need to match, not match the volume per se, but I guess match the stimulating repetitions. So, and you could count that out. Like you could literally look at, okay, how many sets did I take to failure? I took 4 sets to failure. I got, give or take, 20 maximally stimulating repetitions. Or I did 8 sets and I had 2 to 3 reps in reserve. Okay, I got about 20 maximally stimulating repetitions. So you can just work that out for yourself.
Yeah, cool. I love that answer. And I feel like that gives a little bit of clarity to those who might feel like they don't enjoy pushing to that point of, I guess, when the fear comes into the repetition, like if technique's not good, something could go wrong, which is where, again, you choose the right exercises that you would feel comfortable pushing on as well with the client. But yeah, I love that. Now, I guess this brings me to my next point in terms of breaking through junk volume. So we've obviously just talked about the very small amount of volume when done in a stimulating fashion that you need to stimulate muscle growth. What do you find is the most common mistake that you see with muscle building programs these days? And how do you coach differently to this and why?
Yeah, so if we were to say what junk volume is, I think a good definition of that would be any excess volume that's unproductive, right? So if it's not serving our need in terms of contributing to hypertrophy. So if we just looked at that example of about 5 repetitions in a set contributing to hypertrophy, you could make the argument that anything above that in essence is unproductive. You could kind of call that junk. Now, does that mean that there's never a purpose to doing that? Not necessarily. Like you said, maybe someone doesn't feel safe lifting heavy loads, yeah? Or maybe someone's injured and it hurts the joints if they go too heavy, whatever, yeah? So you could say, well, okay, maybe I'm doing sets of 10 and I understand that the first half of that set isn't doing anything, but for me, it's making me feel better. Yeah. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's the wrong decision for that person, but as long as we can justify why we're doing it. Ultimately, all load selection is, like in terms of if we do 5 repetitions or 10 or 20, the load we're selecting is just telling us how many repetitions we have to do until we get to that stimulating part. So if we choose a light load, we have to do a lot of repetitions till we get to that stimulating part. If we choose a heavy load, we don't have to do many. So I'd say, like, if we look at the hypertrophy impact, like I said before, both of those are going to be similar, whether you're picking 5 or 20 repetitions. Just because a hypertrophy stimulus, though, is similar, doesn't mean that everything else is the same. So if we were to do a set of 20 and you're doing that to failure, you're getting, your 4 or so stimulated repetitions in that set, not only are you getting a good stimulus, but you are getting this huge amount of what are called calcium ions, and that basically contributes to fatigue. So, and I don't mean felt fatigue. I don't mean you do your set and you feel tired, although you probably will if you're doing a set of 20. But we're getting this influx of these calcium ions that basically need to be recycled. They need to be taken out again. And if there's too much there for the mitochondria to remove, essentially what it does is start to damage part of the cell. So we're now in a state, and this will happen to an extent with lower repetitions as well, but it will happen significantly more if we're doing higher repetitions. So now we're choosing to do our sets of 20. We're getting our stimulating repetitions. That's all good, but we're also getting a stack of muscle damage along the way. Now, in the moment in time, that's not necessarily a big issue, okay? We can still do our workout, that's fine. But that muscle damage post-workout, that's going to start to cause some issues. So now we need to repair that muscle damage. It's damage to contractile protein. So the muscle is just not going to work very well until we've repaired that damage. Depending on how much volume you did, and again, bearing in mind that the high repetitions are going to be more damaging, that muscle repair, that could take several days. If it's bad enough, it can take a week, right? And so someone's doing, say you have 2 different people, and one of them is doing 4 sets of 5, and maybe they're keeping 1 repetition in reserve, like you were talking about before, compared to someone who's doing 4 sets of 20. And even if they're keeping 1 repetition in reserve and we're kind of matching the stimulus, that person who's doing 4 sets of 5, 2 or 3 days later, they may be fine to train that muscle again. Any damage is gone, right? But that person who's doing those high rep sets of 20, again, that might take 4 or 5 days. They're not going to get much benefit training that muscle again until the end of the week. Maybe they need to wait the whole week again to do it. So this is where I mentioned before, like the question about like how often should you train, what split is best. It's a hard question to answer because it depends on what you're doing in the session. For that person who's doing those high repetitions, they can't go back and do a full body 2 days later because they've caused too much damage. So I'd say that is the number one issue I'm seeing that people are just not talking about is fatigue and recovery. People are so focused on what they're doing in the gym in that session, that moment of time, that they don't realize what they did 2 days ago is actually affecting what they're doing in that session. Because that, I know I've talked about the muscle damage, but just so people understand, essentially, if that muscle damage is there, it's not only going to be affecting that muscle. So let's say you do a stack of high repetitions biceps 2 days earlier, and then 2 days later we're in the gym and now we're doing lower body. The fact that we've caused so much muscle damage in our biceps 2 days earlier, that's actually causing an inflammatory response now, right? And so that inflammation, we're basically we're neurologically perceiving that inflammation's impacting our blood-brain barrier, and that's causing a reduction in central motor command, basically. So it's causing like a central nervous system fatigue mechanism, right? So that is now going to affect our ability to actually utilize any muscle, not just our biceps, but our calves, our quads, anything. So sure, it's not going to impact other muscles as badly as it'll impact the biceps, but it's going to impact our ability to use the highest, what we call high threshold motor units, basically the motor units and muscle fibers that have the best potential to grow and get bigger. It's going to reduce our ability to use those in any muscle. Yeah. So even if you're using a split where you're training a muscle once a week and you're like, well, it's okay if I cause muscle damage because I'm not training that muscle again for 5 or 6 days or 7 days. Yeah, that's mitigating some of it, but you're still missing out because the CNS fatigue is still affecting other muscles as well.
Yeah, I love that. What would you say in terms of, I guess, managing that sort of fatigue with the programs that you see that are sort of 6 days in the gym training for our natural athletes again? 6 days in the gym, say like a female bikini program where it's like lower, upper, lower, upper, lower, upper. And the exercises gradually get become sort of more isolated. Like there's more kickbacks at the end of the week, and at the start of the week it's your squats, your deadlifts, that sort of a thing. How would you, or what would you adjust in a program like that for someone who came to you who was maybe doing that previously?
Yeah. Yeah. So I always have a hard sell with new clients of trying to lower the volume and lower how many times in the gym. And people want to know why. Like, I think a mistake that coaches make sometimes is just telling someone what to do. And if someone doesn't understand why they're doing that, I don't think it's going to stick. Usually, some clients will stick, but a lot of people, there's not a lot of motivation if they don't understand why something's important. So if I had someone like that come to me and she's doing 6 days a week and doing kind of what you explained, I would start by explaining why that might not be best physiologically and kind of similar stuff we were just talking about. And based on how well that person's taking that, that's going to then dictate what I'm going to do with them next. And if they're like, man, that makes total sense, do with me whatever you think, great, we're going to like really drop it back. If she's like, oh yeah, okay, but I think I recover okay and whatever else, I'm like, okay, so I'm going to need to meet you in the middle. I'm probably going to need to give you a little bit more than I actually want to, but we're going to need to do it intelligently so it's not negatively impacting you as much as it could. Yeah. So in that situation, because a lot of bikini athletes are going to be like, I'm not doing 3 days a week. Like, that's insane. I'm going to do 5 days, like at minimum. So if that's kind of where I'm meeting them in the middle, 4 or 5 days instead of 6 days, okay, it is what it is. But in that instance, we're going to do what we can to limit that muscle damage, right? So some of the things we can do, and one of the benefits of the example you gave is a split like that, like an upper lower split. If we think about muscle damage is muscle specific. Yeah. So if you're doing full body, your ability to cause excess amounts of muscle damage, that's going to be the lowest split to cause muscle damage, right? Because you're doing all different muscles in that one day. So how much volume can one muscle have? Like 2 sets, 4 sets? Like, it's hard to do 10 sets for every single muscle if you're doing full body. The second hardest to cause a lot of muscle damage is going to be something like an upper lower split. Yeah. Because you're still doing 4 or 5 different muscles in that session. Again, how much total volume can you put into one muscle to cause a huge amount of muscle damage? It can still be done, but it's going to be less. The worst is going to be like a full growth split where you're doing 1 or 2 muscles a session. How do you mitigate muscle damage in that instance? Like, it's very, very difficult to do that. So someone comes to me, upper lower split. Okay, I can work with that. Okay, maybe I prefer you do 4 days instead of 6 days, but we can work with that split. But what else can we do to mitigate some of that damage apart from lowering the volume? Well, we could reduce some exercises that are going to be more damaging. So it's not so much, like you mentioned, like compounds and then more isolated movements. For me, that's not as much of a concern. It's probably more if it's like a lengthened exercise, if it's a shortened exercise. So if someone's doing hammies, they're doing lower body and they're doing a lot of hammies. Well, if they're doing like a Romanian deadlift or stiff leg deadlift, like that is going to be causing a fair bit of damage, right? Like that lengthened position movement. If we give them something like a back extension where, you know, the load and the lowest in that stretch position is dropping off because of the strength curve, or we give them like a lying leg curl, there's going to be a fair bit less muscle damage that's going to be incurred in that exercise. So I'd be looking at, okay, if we're doing 4, 5, God forbid, 6 days, I'm going to be giving you short muscle movements on basically all of those days. And that last day, where you then have at least 1, maybe 2 days off, that's the only day I'm going to give you lengthened work, because at least you got that little bit longer there to recover. That would be the main change I'd be making exercise selection wise, and then just reducing those repetitions. If I can get someone closer to that, 5 to 8 repetition mark, and again, I'm going to mitigate some of that excess calcium accumulation. But I do think, like, if we look at natural athletes, again, we go back to before drugs and anabolics, there were athletes back then who were training every single day. Now, they were usually using 1 set. Well, they were almost always using 1 set per muscle. But some of the strongmen, some of the biggest bodybuilders naturally that we've ever seen, they were doing 1 set per muscle per day. So, if someone wants to do 6 days a week, to an extent, well, I guess we can make it work. We just have to be intelligent.
Cool. I love that. And that's such a positive way to look at it, because I think very often you'll hear like a hard nose with a lot of things. And I think that demotivates a lot of people to venture down the routes that scientifically there's a lot of evidence now that those routes can be more positive in terms of recovery, that sort of a thing. Can I get you to explain the difference between a shortened position exercise and a lengthened position exercise?
So it does depend a little bit on particular muscles. Like the idea doesn't, but like whether a muscle really is going to be damaged as much in a lengthened position depends a bit on the muscle. But essentially, if you were, the best way to explain it in a simple way is imagine you had Velcro, and then imagine that Velcro, you overlaid the Velcro, like you matched it up perfectly, and it was like there was no edges hanging out. Like that's just like a mid position exercise where there's like perfect overlapping. And then imagine we now overlap it where like only the tips are overlapping and like the rest of the Velcro pieces are like, you know, they're not touching, they're hanging off the edges. Because there's like only that little bit of overlap, that's causing a huge amount of, I guess, I don't know what the right word would be here, but let's just go with pressure on that one little bit that's overlapping. And if you now pull that apart, like that little bit that's overlapping, that's going to cause a stack of, I guess, damage ultimately to that Velcro. In essence, that's kind of what's happening. And then the opposite can happen where imagine you like overlap the Velcro so much or you like bundled it up so it was like so overlapped that it wasn't properly flush and lined up. That would be the opposite. That would be like some muscles in a very short position where you would call that active insufficiency, which means that it's so bundled up, it can't properly create what's called cross bridging. So it can't really create mechanical tension that well. So depending on the muscle itself will depend on how susceptible it is to getting in that really short position where it can't do much, getting that really lengthened position where it's causing a lot of damage. Some muscles, like the joint, will protect us. It's just not going to get into that position. Other muscles, they're going to get into that position really easily. So generally speaking, though, if you just think about if I'm doing an exercise and I'm getting to the top of that exercise, that's usually going to be a shortened part. And so if I'm at the bottom of that exercise and I'm stretching out that limb or whatever it is, that's usually going to be the lengthened part.
Yeah, cool. I like that. Would you also say if someone's in an exercise and they're not sure, but they're focusing on the sensations they're feeling, would you say a shortened exercise, someone will typically feel something like a pump much sooner, whereas a lengthened, someone would maybe feel the muscle after the set? From a sensation standpoint.
Possibly. So from a sensation standpoint, so in that shortened position, often, you know, when like you flex and like you get really crampy and it's like, oh man, I can almost call it. Yeah, like that would be usually more in that shortened position. It's much harder to get that sensation at a lengthened position, but some people don't have that great sort of mind-muscle connection, so they may not really be able to tell that. The lengthened stuff is really what's going to cause you more, usually more DOMs. Like DOMs is not the best predictor of muscle damage, but if you go again, you do like a, you know, heavy stiff leg deadlift, I would imagine your hammy is going to be fairly sore the next day. So that's not a bad metric. It's not perfect, but it's not bad that if you equate the stuff that's really causing you to be more sore, if it's exercises you do more often, like if you do something that's totally new, anything's going to make you sore. But if you've done it for a few weeks, and this particular exercise is making you really sore, most likely those are more lengthened positions.
Cool. And then when you feel really sore after a workout, just for those listening, that's the DOMS, that's delayed onset muscle soreness. In terms of, there was a term that you mentioned that I would love for you to expand on as well, cross-bridging. Yeah. What does that mean and how can someone apply that, I guess, that knowing what that means to their own training? Just in layman, we're bringing it down layman's terms, so it's super simple.
Yeah. I'm not sure how some. I'll see if I can end somewhere into how someone can apply it. But in terms of what it is, So if we imagine, let's go even a step further back. So I've used the word motor units. Okay, so motor units. Sometimes people confuse this with muscle fibers. So a muscle fiber, you've got heaps of muscle fibers. Yeah, every muscle's got stacks of muscle fibers, and those muscle fibers are grouped together. And they're grouped in what's known as a motor unit. And basically all those muscle fibers, they're kind of like recruited essentially or used by the same motor neuron. Okay, so there's a group of muscle fibers that are all hanging out together. They're not actually necessarily next to each other, but they're all related. So they're all going to be used at the same time. Now, when we're talking about muscle growth and we're talking about mechanical tension and what stimulates muscle growth, we're not talking about a muscle as a whole. We're talking about muscle fibers. Like a muscle fiber is what's getting bigger or getting smaller. Yeah. So you could simultaneously have muscle fibers in your biceps that are getting bigger and other muscle fibers that are getting smaller if you didn't train the ones that are getting smaller. Yeah. So essentially what we're wanting to do is create mechanical tension in all or as many muscle fibers as we can. Now, the thing that's creating mechanical tension, to go back to that Velcro analogy, I think Velcro works quite well for muscles. We've got what are called contractile proteins. So we've just got parts within the muscle fiber. And we've got what are called myosin, and we've got what are called actin. They're kind of like our Velcro. And so they're going to attach to each other, and they're going to, it's called a power stroke. Basically, they're just going to pull each other closer together, essentially. And when they do that, when they're attaching, that's what we would call cross-bridging. Okay, so they're creating this cross-bridge, more attachment sites. And the longer that those attachment sites are attached, like literally, like just longer duration, that's what's going to enhance mechanical tension. Like that's going to be a good thing for muscle growth. So if you imagine jumping, you do a vertical jump and you a power exercise, there's not long that those sites are attached for. And it's almost like, again, let's go back to Velcro, and it's almost like the Velcro is like skipping over each other. Like it's just not kind of creating that attachment site for very long. So something like that, you're using a lot of muscle fibers, but the cross-bridging just isn't really sufficient to create enough mechanical tension. At the same time, if you're doing like a lightweight exercise, some muscle fibers that are being used to do that, because you're not going to use all muscle fibers. If you're doing like a 1 kilo bicep curl, like you're only using the muscle fibers you need to use in that instance. So those ones, cool, you'll have mechanical tension. The myosin and actin are going to be pulling, but the muscle fibers that aren't being used, they're not experiencing that. So that takes us back to that stimulating reps model where we need that slow speed. So we've got a lot of that cross-bridging going on, but we want that to be happening in as many muscle fibers as possible. So in terms of how do we apply that knowledge? Well, I guess it we talked about reps in reserve before. And I think sometimes it can be valuable to know there's nothing magic about repetitions. And sometimes people make the mistake if they say, well, I'm aiming for 8 to 10 repetitions, and they get 10 and they stop. And ultimately, what we know, like if we know mechanical tension is what's causing the results here, that's what's stimulating hypertrophy. And again, the cross-bridging, we know that where that's most efficient is when it's happening at a slow speed. I think that changed a lot in our perception, or our sort of, how we treat a set, where we realize our goal here is not to get 10 repetitions. Our goal here is not to, whatever. Our goal is to actually get to a point where there's enough mechanical tension where we're slowing down. So, and even I think an application for this that I've only just sort of been thinking about over the last 6 months or a year is, you hear people talk about how they train to failure. And, people are like, I train to failure every single set, train to failure. And then you watch their videos or you see them in the gym. And what they do is they get to a point where they can't lift that load with good form. And then the form goes out the window and they keep going. And now what happens is their speed doesn't slow down. So now they start cheating the weight up. And eventually they get to a point where they just can't move that weight anymore. But at no point did they actually slow down in the repetitions. And so I think a good mental shift to make is, it's good, it's fine, it's beneficial to actually have that slowing down, that grind. Like that's a good thing. And so if you are choosing to train a failure, the way to fail is not to reduce your range of motion with each additional repetition and not get looser and looser form until you just like, elastic band the weight away and it's just all momentum. The way to fail is actually to allow that really slow repetition to happen, and you'll get a couple of those out. And then that last repetition will be like an 8-second repetition where it just gets stuck, wherever that sticking point is. Like that would be the way to fail. So if I had to apply it somehow, that's probably
I love
how
that. And I think you highlighted an important point in terms of people pushing close to a point where they feel it's failure and their technique gets what I call, and many of my clients will be familiar with this term listening, floppy technique, where it's like those reps to me mean very little. Like if you're going floppy, it's like you're not using the same muscle that you're trying to target to strengthen, to grow.
Yeah.
What would you say in terms of pushing to failure and using an appropriate method? So if you're someone where, if we bring it back to the start of the conversation, and we spoke about someone who might be a little fearful of pushing close to that failure point in the gym, say by means of going to like 5 or 6 reps to failure, 5 or 7 reps to failure. What about something like a rest pause method, where you might do 2 repetitions, rest for 5 seconds, 2 repetitions, rest for 5 seconds? What is a rest pause method, and is that an effective way to get used to pushing yourself close to that point where you're getting those maximally stimulating reps?
So if we think about what is it that's causing hypertrophy, we talked about that slowing down of velocity, yeah? So because we've established it's somewhere like 5 repetitions in a set that's going to cause that, that means that in those final 5 repetitions is going to be a slight slowing down in speed. So they should theoretically feel a bit different to other repetitions in the set. And it doesn't mean that 5 repetitions out of failure is going to be like a 5-second rep, yeah? Like I'm not saying it's going to be that slow, but you're going to feel different. And so you talked about like that sensation will, like a rest pause set or something like that, help you get there. I think anytime you're lifting, so when we're lifting at a heavy enough load or close to failure, we're using as many muscle fibers as we can, okay? So it's maximal voluntary activation of recruitment. So let's say you use a 5 rep max, like you said, even if you just do 1 or 2 repetitions with that, you're using as many muscle fibers as you can. You're having a slowing down in the velocity. You're getting stimulating repetitions. So you may not feel mentally what it's like to go to that point where you push yourself to maximal effort. And because if we imagine we've got a certain amount of effort we can actually tolerate, yeah? So when we get to failure, all that's happened is we've exceeded that maximum amount of effort we can work with. So if you're doing a 5 rep max and you're doing 2 repetitions, you're not getting close to that maximum amount of effort. So you're not necessarily feeling the same thing you'd be feeling when you get into failure. But from like a muscle perspective, you're starting to feel it. Yeah, like you're starting to feel what a heavy load's like, maximal activation's like. So I think that's it's a good tool to use to be able to show someone, hey, this is like, these are the money repetitions. Like these are the ones we're chasing. If you're not feeling this, we're probably not going hard enough. Yeah. Is it a good tool for someone to learn psychologically what it feels like to push to failure? Probably not, but there's still value to it. In terms of like cluster sets or rest pause sets, so the way, like what you'd explained there, like I would call that more of like a cluster set where you're picking like a certain, load, and then you're doing, let's say you've got a 5 repetition max and you do 2, 2, 2. You do 6 repetitions with a 5 rep max. And you've got a short little break between those doubles, or those 2 repetitions. Something like that is really interesting because A, like we've established, you've now learned what it should feel like from a muscle perspective to be lifting a heavy load. But B, if we've established that about that 5 rep max is maximal motor unit recruitment and we're getting some stimulating work, every single one of those repetitions should actually be stimulating. So you've actually, in that instance, you've achieved more total stimulating volume than you would have achieved with a normal set done to failure. And you may not have actually failed at all in that set. Maybe that last set of 2, you might get close to failure depending on how long you're waiting between sets. But theoretically, you might still be 1 or 2 repetitions away from failure, and you've got more stimulating work than you would have done with a single set to failure. So I think those methods, clusters, rest pause, would be a little bit different. Usually with a rest pause, normally what you do is take that first set to failure or close to failure, and then using the same load, you'll get a couple additional reps after waiting a little bit longer. But very similar mentality. As far as like intensification methods or advanced methods or whatever, I think those in my mind are arguably the only 2 I can think of off the top of my head that could offer, I don't want to say they're better than standard sets, but they could offer an advantage that maybe you wouldn't always get with a standard set.
I love that. And yeah, that's exactly, in terms of sort of explaining that, I feel like you explained that really well as well. And I feel like everyone will understand that. So that's awesome. Awesome. Now, in terms of wrapping up today's episode, I would love to know 3 takeaway points. So someone's listening to this, they're really into their strength training. They want to skyrocket their progress, okay, with muscle growth, with progressing in the gym. What are 3 takeaway points that you would want someone to take from this?
Yeah. So maybe someone's listening to this and like, well, I don't know, am I doing too much volume? Like, how do I even know that? The easiest way to work that out is really to look at your logbook. Okay, so if you log the weights you're doing, you log how much weight you're moving for how many repetitions in your last session you compare to your next session. If that's not changing over time, then there's an issue. Yeah, and it might be you're doing too much volume. In some cases, maybe you're not doing enough volume, but that's not usually going to be the case. It might be that you're not pushing yourself hard enough. Maybe you've actually got 5 or 6 repetitions left in the tank and you're stopping early. But either way, there's something going on. If the weight is not going up over time, and it's not gone up for a few sessions in a row, there's an issue there in what you're doing. So the number one takeaway I'd say is learn to do that. Like in what other hobby would you do something and think, if I get worse at that, I'm succeeding? Like we would never do that. Like if I'm learning to play piano and there's a song I'm learning and I'm getting worse and worse at that song over time, my piano practice isn't working out for me. Yet we think if we go to the gym and I lift less this week than last week, that's fine as long as I go to failure. Like I don't understand why people have that mentality. Clearly something's not working. So I know that people who are listening to this are probably more focused on body composition than strength, and they're saying, well, I don't care about strength. But the reality is, if you're building muscle, you are getting stronger because you're adding contractile proteins. So step number one is actually pay attention to your workout logs or your plans or whatever, and are you lifting more load over time? Now, if we extend that, the second point I'd make is people are individual, and while there's some, I guess, broader recommendations we can make, and I've made some of those as far as set numbers and stuff like that, we do need to acknowledge that what's working best for someone else may not work best for you. And it could be, it could be because maybe you do recover slower. Maybe you've got a high amount of stress in your life. Like we know that significantly delays muscle recovery. There's good studies on that. So for whatever reason it is for you, you may recover faster, slower. You may need less volume. You may do okay with more volume. And so once we've established, are you progressing or not? And people don't like doing this, but I do think it's, if you want to be doing this for a long time, like if you want to be in the gym for a long time and maximizing results, at some point it's worth you spending a bit of time and customizing it and working out for yourself what does work better for me. And if you've got a coach, hopefully the coach is trying to work that out for you or with you. But you might say you're doing 2 sets twice a week per muscle, and you're like, yeah, I am getting stronger. Okay, good. What happens if we add another set to that? Do you progress quicker or slower? Do you stay the same? What's happening? Give that a go for a couple of weeks. What if we add a 4th set? And you may find, usually what people are going to find is there's the point where they get better quicker and then kind of plateaus, and eventually they'll get worse again. And that's where they're just not recovering between those sessions. So I know a lot of people don't love doing it because it takes a few weeks to do, and experimenting and whatever else. But again, if you want to do this for the next decade or 20 years or whatever, like it's worth actually working out for yourself. Do I recover quicker than other people, slower than other people? Really, what's gonna work best for me? And then, look, there's so many points we could make, but I think one that I often hear, those like, not memes, but those things that just get said, people just say stuff and it sounds deep and meaningful, but usually it's not. There's one of those things that just gets said a lot, and it's like, something like, it's not your good days in the gym that matter, it's turning up on your bad days, or, something like that. And it's like, oh, cool, that's motivating and whatnot. But, and like, I'm sure I've heard that in the past.
I'm going in
oh, yeah,
now.
that's cool. Like, I agree with it. But
Yeah,
totally. And, if you're the kind of person who's like, oh, well, if it's up to me, I'm going to go once a week. Okay, good. Like, maybe you do need to hear that. Yeah. But I think maybe a slightly better way of thinking about that would be, what can we do to make those bad days good days, right? Because it kind of brings us back to that first point of what's a bad day. Like, I would think a bad day is a day you go in, nothing felt good, you didn't progress your weights, like you didn't progressively overload anything. That's kind of still a bad day. Like you didn't actually progress like that. We don't want those days. Like, honestly, the days that are actually getting you better are the good days. So what can we do to make as many of those bad days good days? And I actually think there's a lot we can do there. So whether that's, like, depending on why it's a bad day, like maybe it's a bad day because you've had an argument with your partner and, business is stressful and whatever. Okay, well, maybe in that instance, if you just take 20 minutes before your session, maybe you listen to something that's motivating for you, maybe you do meditation. You look at a lot of the old-timer lifters, and a lot of those guys actually say before your session, like, lie on the floor. Just lie there, flat on the floor for 5 or 10 minutes. Don't do anything. Just get in the headspace. And so that might be enough to make that into a good day for you. Or maybe it's a bad day because you're sleep deprived. Okay, what can we do to make that better? Well, we know that if you train earlier rather than later in the day, if you're sleep deprived, it's going to be a bit better. We know that coffee. I'm a big fan of coffee. Coffee's actually going to make that your performance a bit better on those days. We know that lower body sessions are probably going to suffer more from sleep deprivation than upper body sessions. So could we be intelligent and go in and say, okay, I didn't sleep well yesterday, but I feel okay in the morning. It's not late. I've had 2 coffees, and now I'm going to pick just maybe half of my upper body session. I'm not going to focus on all the volume I would normally do. I'm just going to focus on 1 or 2 sets of each exercise, or one exercise per muscle. And my goal today is to lift more in that one set than I have in the past. And you're still going to progress doing that. Like, that's not just you ticking things over. That's actually, you got better that day. You'd probably increase motor unit recruitment that day. Like, you took a big step forward. So I think if people can take away one thing, I'd say take that away. How can you actually have more good days? And I haven't said this yet, but as far as the volume conversation goes, we know that one set is the most important, right? It takes, if we think about how much hypertrophy one set gives you, it takes 6 sets to double the amount of hypertrophy one set is going to give you. So if you go in the gym and again, you're feeling awful that day, you're tired, whatever, you're busy, and your program has you doing 20 sets in total and you're doing, 5 or 6 sets per muscle, do one set. Like, go in, do a light warm-up, do a heavy warm-up set, and then smash one working set. And 9 times out of 10, when I give clients one working set, they hit a PB. And I don't even think it's a conscious thing. I honestly think there's a subconscious thing that's holding you back if you know you've got 4 sets to do. So let's use it to our advantage. So that would be my my last piece of advice, is let's make more good days in the gym.
I love that. And that's definitely something, as of the last few months, probably the better part of the last 6 months, the amount of programs I write that have 2 sets and 1 set in them. Whereas before it was very guilty of like the 4 sets of 6 to 8, 8 to 10, that sort of a thing. And it's so much more time, it's so much more accumulated fatigue. And those first 3 sets arguably are not even close to stimulating. And you're lucky if that last set is just by built up sort of fatigue, but is it really that stimulating then? Whereas if you just did 1 or 2 and you actually pushed to your full potential and tapped into that.
Do you do that yourself? Do you do 1 or 2 sets yourself sometimes?
Yeah, all the time. And my strength since doing that has skyrocketed. Yeah.
Yeah. I find like that 1 set thing, it's unbelievable. There's limitations because it is hard to always progressively overload 1 set, and that's why people may not like it. But like, even for myself, like I'm guilty of usually taking every set to failure. Most will be 1 rep in reserve, but usually I'll take every set to failure. And even then, if I do 1 set, I'm still hitting PBs almost always. And I can't put that down to anything conscious because I'm taking sets to failure anyway. Like, it's got to be some weird subconscious thing where you're just not being held back so much because there's not any future work to do. So, yeah, again, there are some limitations, but if someone actually wants to see where their limit is or what their sort of true strength capacity is, do some time doing 1 set.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one thing I'll add as well for our listeners is sometimes when you aim to do 1 set of, say, 6 to 8 repetitions, and you get to the 8 and you could have done 11 or 12, and you stop at maybe 8 or 9, and you're like, you know what, I'm going to put that back early, and that's a warm-up set. I'm going to rest for 3 minutes, I'm going to pop on some more weight, and I'm going to do this properly. So there's also that as well, where it's like you're actually taking the weights that you're lifting seriously instead of just following your program and progressively overloading on paper, when it's like, well, hold on, what have the muscles got to give?
Yeah, exactly. If that's all you've got, that's the only opportunity, you're going to take it more seriously.
This has been such an insightful conversation. Again, I am so grateful to have you on the pod. Very, very much fangirling. And I was telling my mum just before this likewise. I was like, guess what? Tell everyone where we can find you, what services you offer as well. And yeah.
It's been an awesome convo. Thank you for having me. So if people want to learn more, like you said, I've got a training account now. So I did split stuff up because, like I said, I did kind of get known just for doing gut health stuff, and a lot of people interested in that weren't necessarily interested in this. So I've got one account, which is kind of all like gut health, blood work, all the functional health stuff. That's my main social media account, which is just coach_Jake Doleschal. And then I've got Jake Doleschal Training, which is all my hypertrophy content. if people want to see the way I program, I've got a Train Heroic. You can sign up for like, I think it's a week and you don't have to pay anything. So you can see the very least kind of how a phase works and what kind of volumes I'm using. Like we've gone over, it's probably half as much volume as most people are used to. And like you mentioned before, I've got a WhatsApp group, which is kind of more like education based. Essentially, I share like an educational topic each weekday. And then there's a database with like health protocols, blood work info, training templates, some physiology stuff in there. There's going to be some more new physiology stuff coming soon, which I'm really excited for. But yeah, that's all. All the info there is on my social media
I can definitely
accounts.
say the weekly education channel is my little vault that I refer to very often. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for everything that you do as well. You are such an amazing human. Very grateful to have you. Cool.
Thank you, Zoe.